The Whispering Well, 1984, 9:22 p.m., Westfield Cemetery, on the evening of October 14, 1984, the small town of Westfield, Ohio, experienced its first homicide in 37 years. The discovery that followed would consume the community for months, spark one of the most extensive investigations in the state's rural history, and leave a question that remains unanswered to this day. Westfield had always been the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's business, where doors were left unlocked, and where the most exciting event of the year was the county fair's demolition derby. The town sat nestled in the rolling hills of southeastern Ohio, a community of roughly 2,300 residents, most of whom trace their families back several generations. The Westfield Cemetery sat on a gentle slope at the northern edge of town, a well-maintained patch of green where elaborate Victorian headstones stood alongside simple military markers, where locals brought flowers on Memorial Day, and where children sometimes dared each other to walk past the wrought iron gates after dark. It was precisely at 9:22 p.m. on that October evening that Harold Brennan, the town's only night patrolman, discovered something that would shatter Westfield's illusion of safety forever. The weather that day had been unseasonably warm for autumn, with temperatures hovering around 68 degrees Fahrenheit under overcast skies that promised rain but delivered none. The ground, softened by a week of earlier showers, made walking somewhat difficult across the cemetery's well-tended grass. Officer Brennan had been making his standard nightly rounds, a formality more than a necessity in a town that rarely saw any crime more serious than underage drinking. He carried a flashlight, though the beam was unnecessary, on the lit paths that wound through the older sections of the burial ground. His habit was to check the cemetery around 9 o'clock, a loop that took approximately 20 minutes and allowed him to clear his mind before returning to the station to complete his reports. The Whispering Well was not its official name. Officially, it was simply an old stone well located in the northeast corner of Westfield Cemetery, a curiosity from the 19th century that had once served the farm that previously occupied the land. The well had been sealed decades earlier, its stone walls rising to about 3 feet in height, covered by a rusted iron grate that had become tarnished with age and moss. Locals called it the Whispering Well for reasons that had grown obscure with time, though some older residents claimed you could hear voices if you leaned close to the opening on particularly still nights. Whether this was true or merely the product of rural folklore and overactive imaginations, no one could say. But the name had stuck, and it was to this location that Officer Brennan's flashlight beam fell at 9:22 p.m. on October 14, 1984. What he saw caused him to radio dispatch, with a voice that trembled in a way it never had before. The body of a young woman lay at the base of the old well, arranged with an almost ceremonial precision. She was lying on her side, curled slightly forward, her hands folded beneath her head as though she were merely sleeping. She wore a blue cardigan, dark jeans, and brown leather boots. Her hair, a dark auburn, was loose and fanned across the grass. There was no visible blood, no obvious signs of violence. She might have been sleeping, except that her skin had taken on the waxy pallor of the dead, and except for the small brass pendant that lay beside her, catching the beam of Brennan's flashlight. Her name was Margaret Ellen Calloway. She was 23 years old. Margaret had grown up in Westfield, the middle child of Harold and Patricia Calloway, who owned the hardware store on Main Street. She had graduated from Westfield High School in 1979, where she had been a quiet but popular student, active in the drama club, and remembered by teachers as exceptionally bright, but perhaps not challenged enough by the limited curriculum of a small rural school. After graduation, she had attended Ohio State University for 2 years before returning home, citing homesickness and a desire to be closer to her aging grandparents. In the months before her death, she had been working as a substitute teacher at Westfield Elementary, filling in for a teacher on maternity leave, and had begun taking night classes at the community college in the neighboring town, pursuing a degree in social work. Those who knew her described Margaret as kind, somewhat reserved, and possessed of a dry sense of humor that surfaced only with people she trusted. She had been dating a young man named Daniel Marsh, a local plumber, for approximately 6 months. The relationship was described by friends as serious, though Margaret had recently expressed some doubts about its future. She was close to her family, particularly her father, with whom she spoke nearly every day. She had no known enemies, no history of conflict with anyone in town. She was, by every account, the last person anyone would expect to find dead in a cemetery. The investigation began immediately, led by the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation with support from the county sheriff's department. Detective Samuel Reyes, a 20-year veteran of the BCI, was assigned as lead investigator. In his initial assessment at the scene, Detective Reyes noted several unusual elements that would shape the direction of the inquiry. The body showed no signs of external trauma. There were no wounds, no contusions visible on the skin, no indication of strangulation. The absence of obvious cause of death was perplexing. Additionally, the positioning of the body suggested deliberation rather than haste. Margaret had been placed at the well with care, her appearance arranged, almost reverently. There were no signs of a struggle in the immediate vicinity, no disturbed earth, no broken branches, no evidence that she had been brought to the location against her will, though that remained a possibility. The autopsy, conducted 2 days later at the county medical examiner's office, revealed that Margaret Calloway had died of cardiac arrest induced by a combination of barbiturates and alcohol. The toxicology report showed a blood alcohol level of 0.08, just below the legal limit for driving, and therapeutic levels of a barbiturate commonly prescribed for anxiety. The medical examiner determined that the combination had proven fatal, though whether this was accidental or intentional remained unclear. There were no indications of injection marks or other evidence that the drugs had been administered against her will. The investigation now faced a central question. Had Margaret Calloway taken her own life, or had someone else made that decision for her? The pendant found beside her body provided the first real clue. It was a small brass medallion, circular, approximately 1.5 inches in diameter, bearing an engraved symbol that Detective Reyes did not immediately recognize. The symbol appeared to be some manner of stylized sun or star, with rays extending outward from a central circle. On the reverse side, barely visible under accumulated tarnish, was an inscription in what appeared to be Latin, Lux Aeterna, eternal light. The pendant was not jewelry that any of Margaret's friends or family had ever seen her wear. Where had it come from, and what did it mean? Detectives interviewed everyone who had seen Margaret on the day of her death, October 14. Her mother, Patricia, reported that Margaret had left the house around 2 in the afternoon, saying she was going to the library to study for a test. The Westfield Public Library, a small brick building on Elm Street, confirmed that Margaret had arrived around 2:30 and remained there until approximately 5 p.m., according to the librarian, Helen Park. Miss Park remembered Margaret well because she had commented on how pale and tired the young woman had looked, asking if she was feeling all right. Margaret had replied that she was fine, just tired from studying. From the library, Margaret's movements became less clear. Her father reported that she had returned home briefly around 5:30, changed clothes, and left again, saying she was going for a drive to clear her head. She did not say where she was going, and she did not return for dinner, which was unusual. The family had waited until 8 o'clock before beginning to worry. By 9:30, when Officer Brennan made his discovery, the Calloways were already preparing to call friends and relatives to ask if anyone had seen their daughter. The investigation expanded to include a thorough examination of Margaret's personal effects, her schedule, and her relationships. In her bedroom, detectives found a journal that Margaret had kept for the past 3 years, filled with observations about her life, her hopes, and her concerns. The journal revealed a young woman wrestling with questions about her future, her relationship with Daniel Marsh, and a growing sense of unease that she had difficulty articulating. In entries from the weeks before her death, Margaret mentioned feeling watched, though she could not identify by whom or why. She wrote of dreams that left her unsettled, of a sense that something was following her, though these passages were vague and open to interpretation. Daniel Marsh was interviewed at length. He stated that he had last seen Margaret on the evening of October 13, the day before her death. They had dinner together at a local restaurant and had what he described as a pleasant evening. When asked about the pendant, Daniel claimed he had never seen it before. He expressed grief and confusion, insisting that Margaret had seemed happy, that there had been no indication she was considering harming herself. His alibi for the evening of October 14 was verified through his roommate, who stated that Daniel had been home watching television from approximately 7 p.m. until the following morning. There was no evidence to suggest Daniel Marsh had any involvement in Margaret's death. The pendant became the focus of considerable investigative attention. Detectives showed it to local historians, antique dealers, and eventually to experts in occult symbolism. The symbol, it was determined, appeared to be associated with various neo-pagan movements that had gained popularity in the 1970s and early 1980s, though it did not match any specific organization definitively. The Latin inscription, Lux Aeterna, was common enough in religious contexts, appearing on grave markers and in funerary art. The pendant itself appeared to be mass-produced, likely purchased at a New Age bookstore or head shop, but attempts to trace its origin through manufacturer records proved unsuccessful. As weeks turned to months, the investigation into Margaret Calloway's death yielded more questions than answers. The case was officially classified as death by undetermined means, with the barbiturate and alcohol combination listed as the immediate cause, but the manner left officially unresolved. In practical terms, this meant that while the evidence did not support criminal charges against any individual, authorities were not prepared to rule suicide as the definitive answer either. The presence of the unexplained pendant, the strange positioning of the body at the Whispering Well, and the entries in Margaret's journal suggesting she felt pursued by something unnamed all combined to create a portrait of a young woman whose final hours remained shrouded in mystery. The community of Westfield was deeply affected by Margaret's death. The hardware store that her father had operated for decades saw a gradual decline in customers, as the grief-stricken owner found himself unable to maintain the same level of attention to business. Patricia Calloway stopped attending church, unable to reconcile her daughter's death with her faith. Daniel Marsh eventually left town, reportedly unable to bear the constant reminders of what had happened. The cemetery, once a place of peaceful reflection, took on a different character for many residents, who found themselves avoiding the northeast corner where the old well stood silent. There are details of this case that have never been publicly disclosed, details that Detective Reyes carried with him until his retirement in 1995, and that were eventually released to the National Cold Case Database in 2003. Among these details were the results of latent fingerprints lifted from the brass pendant, which did not match Margaret Calloway or any of the individuals who had been interviewed during the initial investigation. Someone else had handled that medallion, someone whose prints were found on its surface, and that person has never been identified. There is also the matter of the final entry in Margaret Calloway's journal, written in a hand that forensic analysts confirmed was hers, but that appeared more hurried and less legible than her usual script. Dated October 13, 1984, the day before her death, it reads simply, "They found the well. They're going to show me tonight. I don't want to go, but I can't say no. I can't ever say no." What did Margaret mean by they? Who could she not refuse? And what, precisely, were they going to show her? These questions remain unanswered. The case file remains open in the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation's Cold Case Archive, reviewed periodically whenever new forensic technologies emerge that might yield additional evidence. The file contains everything that detectives gathered in the months following October 1984. The interviews, the forensic reports, the journal entries, the analysis of the pendant. It contains the careful handwriting of investigators documenting every lead they pursued and every lead that went nowhere. But it does not contain answers. It does not contain the truth of what happened to Margaret Ellen Calloway in the hours between leaving her family's home on October 14 and the moment Harold Brennan's flashlight fell upon her still farm beside the Whispering Well. The well itself was filled in during the spring of 1985, the decision made by the Cemetery Association in what they described as an effort to eliminate a safety hazard. The stone walls were buried, the rusted grate was removed, and a small marker was placed to indicate that something had once stood there, something that had given the location its name. Most residents of Westfield no longer remember the story, their memories faded by 4 decades of other events, other concerns. But there are some who recall and who still wonder what Margaret Calloway encountered on that autumn evening in 1984. What she saw, or thought she saw, that led her to a place where no one would find her until it was far too late. And there are others, younger residents who have heard the stories told in whispers, who avoid walking past the northeast corner of the cemetery after dark, who speak of hearing something that might be voices, or might be wind, or might be nothing at all, coming from a place where the old well once stood. They speak of it the way their grandparents spoke of it, passing down a name that has become part of the town's mythology,